Okay, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get us started tonight. So I'd like to say good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Tonight we'll be discussing MDOT MTA's Title VI program to discuss the equity portion of their major service changes. Just a little housekeeping so everyone knows this meeting tonight will be recorded and all mics and cameras have been disabled. If you would like to ask any questions or have any comments, we will open up the floor to questions and comments after the brief presentation, or you can type them in the chat and they will be read aloud for the group. So I will go ahead and introduce the team. So I am Latoya F. I am the project manager in the Office of Customer and Community Relations. We have Joe Calhoun, who is our Title VI and ADA coordinator in the Office of Equal Opportunity and Compliance. Jeremy Strauss, who is a senior transportation planner with our consultant firm Foursquare. And Kyle Davis, who is the Chief of Service Planning in the Office of Service Development. Joe will be doing our presentation for us tonight. Oh, he's still there, he is.
Thank you, Latoya. As Latoya noted, my name is Joe Calhoun, and I coordinate Title VI here at MTA. And before we get started into the core of our program, I wanted to give a little background because those of us in the transit industry often use acronyms and technical terms and different jargon, and we expect the public to know what we're talking about, but some of these acronyms may not be terms that the public are familiar with. So when we reference Title VI, we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was proposed by President Kennedy, and it was something that was also signed into law by his vice president, President Lyndon B. Johnson, in 1964, July 2nd of 1964. It was considered one of the landmark pieces of legislation coming out of the civil rights movement. And it was broken into various sections and chapters that the lawyers and Congress referred to as titles. So Title VI is the sixth chapter of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And as I noted, the Civil Rights Act is a civil rights and labor law that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements, and it prohibited racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. For public transportation, we are specifically regulated by the sixth chapter, non-discrimination in federally assisted programs. And this prohibited discrimination on the ground of race, color, or national origin within federally assisted programs. So we cannot exclude individuals from participation in or deny them the benefits of our services, nor can people be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that we operate, because MTA, much like all the transit agencies across the country, receives federal assistance. So in this realm, race, color, and national origin are the realms that are protected under Title VI. Other chapters of law included other classifications. So what does Title VI, that sixth section, that sixth chapter of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 specifically require? It has a number of requirements that we need to be mindful of. So one is that all the transit agencies need to provide assurances on an annual basis to the Federal Transit Administration of their compliance with everything that follows. We have to prepare and submit a program every 3 years that the federal government will review to ensure that we're complying with our non-discrimination requirements in the realm of race, color, and national origin. We have to provide notice to our riders of their protection under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is something that people will see at our metro stations, on our buses, on our website, and in other places where you'll see Title VI notice, and we have it up in English and Spanish. Those Title VI notices are referencing individuals' protections from non-discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. We have to have compliance procedures and complaint forms, which are on our website. We have to record and report any investigations, complaints, or lawsuits that we receive to the federal government. so that they are monitoring those as well to make sure we're handling them properly. We have to promote inclusive public participation, and there's a number of elements of our public participation program that are available on our website in our Title VI program on our Title VI page. We're required to provide meaningful access to limited English proficiency individuals. And that's LEP is the acronym we often use. And that refers to individuals for whom English is not their primary language, who have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English, which is why many of our materials are available in Spanish and other ones are available into translation into a number of other languages upon request. We are required to report the minority representation of our planning and advisory boards. We are required to provide assistance to our subrecipients, which MTA does have nearly 100 subrecipients, which includes the locally operated transit systems across the state. We do monitor those subrecipients, ensure that they're complying with the requirements of Title VI, and certain types of facilities that we develop, certain maintenance facilities and things of that nature. We're required to conduct an equity analysis to make sure that there's not a disparate impact for minority individuals or low-income households when we construct those facilities. We are required to develop system-wide standards for our service and policies, which we do. And then what you'll see here, these ones in bold, these last four items, those are only for large transit agencies, agencies that have 50 or more transit vehicles in operation during their peak service at the same time, as well as operating in a service area that has at least 200,000 people. So if you're joining us from other parts of the state, perhaps in Frederick or Montgomery County, you may think, oh, well, my transit agency doesn't necessarily do these. I haven't noticed this. Are they in violation? And it may be that your local transit agency is not of the size that they have this requirement. But MTA being a very large transit agency, one of the 15 largest in the country, we do fall under these requirements. So in addition to what I said already, MTA is required to conduct a demographic analysis of our service area. And that is something that we have in our Title VI program you can find on our website. We're required to collect data regarding customer demographics and travel patterns. And the main way that we achieve that is by our origin and destination surveys. We conduct surveys on our bus routes every 5 years, as well as on the other modes, Metro, Light Rail, MARC, and commuter bus. And that helps us to know the demographics of our riders to make sure that when we do conduct changes or we have fares that change, that we're not having a disparate impact. We're not having a disproportionate burden for low-income individuals or minorities. We're also required to monitor our service standards and policies and report those results and any actions we've taken if we find any disparities. And those are included in our Title VI program on our website. As well, our staff monitor those on an ongoing basis. And then finally, the last requirement is to evaluate service and fare changes for equity impacts. So that will be the focus of today's presentation is evaluating our service changes for equity impacts. But how do we do that and which ones are evaluated is something that we need to examine. So you may be thinking to yourself at this point, okay, you said, Joe, that Title VI prohibits race discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. What public agency would intentionally discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin? And the situation here is that sometimes well-intentioned service changes could result in unintentional discrimination. So Title VI protects against actions that have both discriminatory intent, where someone intentionally discriminated, but it also protects against actions that have a discriminatory impact. So a transit agency may have had no intention of discriminating. They changed service based on ridership. You know, a route had declining ridership and it continued to decline. They made adjustments to ensure that the reliable service was reliable, the on-time performance was good, that there was not crowding issues. It was going where it needed to go, but the ridership continued to decline and they reduced service. Well, there could be a discriminatory impact there. And that is why we need to evaluate our changes to make sure that we're not unintentionally discriminating. Or in the reverse scenario, if we were adding service, we need to make sure that we're not continually adding service in non-minority areas, because that often means service being cut somewhere else, and that could come at the expense of minority riders or low-income riders. So in order to determine whether a service or fare changes will result in a disparate impact upon minority or disproportionate burden upon low-income riders, that's the important part, the goal of these equity analyses that we do. But when do we do them, and how often? Are we going to do it for all of our changes? So in order to determine such, agencies are required to have a major service change policy, which is what we're going to discuss this evening. We do have a major service change policy that was last updated in 2019 during our Title VI program update and was included in our program that was posted on our website. But we learned some lessons over the course of the pandemic, some lessons that our peers from their experiences as well as our own experiences. And we wanted to make sure that we had a more comprehensive major service change policy to ensure that certain scenarios didn't occur and have changes implemented without the equity impacts of that being evaluated. So we have to define our adverse effects, which we have in our program, and we have to have a policy for disparate impact and disproportionate burden, which we do have in our program. It's a 10% difference between the service area as a whole and the route. So if 10%, there's a 10% difference in minority population between the changes on a route and the service area, then that could be a disparate impact. So for our major service change, this is what triggers, the major service change policy is what triggers these equity analyses. Only service changes that rise to the level of our major service change policy are evaluated for their equity impacts. And it's important to know that these service equity analyses are reviewed by the administrator, the Maryland Transit Administration administrator, who considers all the points that we raise in them, all of the adverse effects and impacts. And then before any service change, any major service change can be implemented, the administrator would have to approve that equity analysis. So what's included though? What types of service changes are included? These include both increases and decreases to service. So it's not just service reductions, but also when we're adding service or creating new bus routes. Those are included within the area that must be examined for major service change service impacts. Changes to service availability, where a route's operating, the span of service, that's also included, the frequency of service, how often the bus operates, and the geographic alignment. It's important to note that these policies are unique for each mode. So we'll go through the policies for each mode because they have different characteristics. So we can't have one policy for all of them because that may not work. And this policy is reviewed at a minimum of every 3 years when we update our program, but we are allowed to update it as necessary and provided that we conduct public outreach. So prior to tonight's meeting, we did meet with our Citizens Advisory Council, our Citizens Advisory Council on Accessible Transportation, and our MARC Riders Advisory Council to gain their input and feedback on these proposed changes. And now we are conducting the first tonight of 3 sessions, virtual sessions, to gather feedback from community organizations and the public at large. And this presentation, as was noted earlier, will be posted on our website so that more of the public can also give us feedback on our proposed changes. So one last thing before I share with you our proposed changes to our policy is some technical terms. Again, there are some terms that we often use that we sometimes assume everyone knows because we use them so often, and within the transit industry, we know what we're referring to, but we want to make sure you know what we're referring to so that there's clarity as we share our policies. So service day is a term we use throughout the program, and that refers to the level of service. Here at MTA, we have 3 principal levels of service for our modes, and there's weekday service, Saturday service, and Sunday service. Some of the modes may have additional unique scenarios for holidays or whatever it may be, but these are the 3 principal ones that we're referring to in our policy. The span of service, I said that earlier, that refers for a given service day, the time from the start of the first revenue trip through the end of the final revenue trip of the day. So it doesn't include any period of time where the bus is traveling from the garage to the beginning of its route or from the garage to from the end of the route to home. It's only when it's in service, when it's operating in revenue service where the public can use the vehicle. Revenue hours, those refer to hours that a transit vehicle spends in revenue service, including time spent picking up and dropping off passengers and operator layover time in between trips. Revenue hours do not include the time spent driving empty vehicles to and from the garages. So it's similar to span of service, but it's the quantifiable way we measure it, the hours of that it operates. We also have revenue miles, which is similar to revenue hours, it's just the miles of which it's operating on the road. Stop at a station. This particularly refers to our rail modes, but it's a single departure or arrival at a given rail station. Core bus system. So when we say core bus system MTA, that's referring collectively to city link routes, local link routes, and express bus link routes together. So all of those routes together is our core bus system. And then finally, service year is a term that is newly used in our Title VI program in the major service change policy. And that refers to 1 calendar year equal to 365 days, or in the case of a leap year, 366 days. So these are terms that you'll see in our policy, and this is what they mean. So with that said, our core bus system is our largest mode. It's what most of our riders interact with. And this is the policy that we currently have for such. Our major service change policy for core bus currently states that an alteration of a route's revenue miles or revenue hours on a given service day by 25% or more, including the establishment or abandonment of a route, is a major service change. So if we were to add 26% onto the City Link Yellow, that would be major, and we'd want to evaluate it. Or in reverse, if we were to reduce the City Link Silver by 27%, that would be a major change. We need to evaluate it for impacts to ensure that we're not having a disparate impact on minorities or a disproportionate burden on low-income individuals. The other element currently in our core bus policy is the change to the span of service on a given route by 90 minutes or more on a given service day. So if the local link 22 currently ends service at 12:30 a.m., let's say, and we propose to end service at 10:50 p.m., that would be a major change. For a lot of folks who may use that route to get to or from work, it may be such that before they were able to take it home from work, perhaps you work in a warehouse or a hospital and you get done work late, and then with that change, they wouldn't be able to. So we would want to make sure we evaluate that for equity impacts. Those two elements are remaining in our policy. We are keeping them, and we have found that they are fairly standard throughout the industry, but we are proposing to add 3 new elements to ensure that there are other scenarios that may not have triggered those two conditions, but what we think are still major and should be evaluated for equity impacts. The first new element to the core bus major service change policy is the alteration of a route's revenue miles or revenue hours on a given service day by a cumulative of 25% over the course of 1 service year. So 25% or more over the course of 1 service year. So if the local link 82, if we were to reduce service by 10% in January of next year, and if we were to reduce service again by 10% in June of next year, and then for whatever reason, we reduce service again in September of next year, currently, that would not be a major change, and that would have never been evaluated for equity impacts in the formal Title VI process. It's important to note that we do evaluate equity in a variety of ways in the service development process, but this is for the formal Title VI analysis that must be reviewed by the administrator and approved by the administrator and submitted to the FTA as part of our Title VI program. That scenario never would have triggered a formal Title VI service equity analysis. And we think it's major. That's a lot of change in less than a year on a given route. And this is now being proposed as part of our major service change policy that a formal Title VI service equity analysis would need to be conducted. The same would apply if it was an addition. So if the City Link red, we decided to add 10% in January, we added 10% in June, and then we added 10% in September. Before adding that 10% in September, we would conduct an equity analysis to see the impacts, to make sure that we are not disproportionately providing a benefit to non-minorities and non-low income, or disproportionately burdening minorities and low-income populations. So that's what that new element achieves. The second new element would be if we added or removed at least 15% of a route's bus stops on a given service day. So if the CityLink Orange, we thinned out bus stops, let's say, we got rid of 20% of the bus stops for whatever reason. Maybe there was feedback that they were stopping too often, or homeowner complaints, or whatever it may be. That would be significant. Some people might have to walk too far to get to their bus routes, to their bus route. Or if we were adding a bunch of stops, that also could have impacts. So we have decided to add a new element to our policy where if we are adding or removing at least 15% of the bus stops relative to the existing bus stops on a route, that would be major and would receive an equity analysis. And then the final new element on our core bus major service change policy would be the cumulative alteration of at least 15% of the total core bus system's revenue miles or revenue hours in a given service change. And this covers a scenario where there's a major change across the system, but none of the routes themselves were changing by 25%. This could happen, say, if there was a major piece of legislation that provided a bonanza of transportation funding and we were adding service. We would all love to see such a thing happen. If we were adding 16% across the whole system, we want to make sure that that addition is done in an equitable manner, that among the routes and among minority populations and non-minority populations, those benefits are being distributed in an equitable manner. We wouldn't want non-minority routes, non-low-income routes, communities that are predominantly minority and or communities that are predominantly non-minority to receive the bulk of those benefits, right? We need to make sure it's done in an equitable manner. And in reverse, if there was a major crisis, such as a pandemic that would cause one to have a proposal where they are proposing widespread reductions of service, this would ensure that if that happens, that it's done in an equitable manner, even if none of the routes are changing by 25%. And you can imagine a scenario where perhaps one route's changing by 20% and another route's changing by 10%. That's a big difference between them, such that there could be inequity, but none of them were changing by 25%. And so, thus it wasn't being evaluated under the current policy. It wouldn't have been required to have been evaluated under the current policy as far as the formal Title VI service equity analysis. So these changes here, we think, will help ensure that changes in service that our riders consider to be major and that we think could occur. We don't have any plans for any of these, but given life experiences of the pandemic, we want to make sure that should there be any future scenario, that these types of changes, should they occur, would be evaluated under the formal Title VI service equity analysis process. So for MARC, we have the current policy is similar, a 25% change in revenue hours or revenue miles on a given service day, including the establishment or abandonment of a line. The change in span of service on a given line by 90 minutes on a given service day. Those two first elements of our current MARC policy mirror our core bus policy. But because MARC has a different characteristic to it in the way it operates, it has other elements in its current policy. And those include a change to the number of stops at a station on a given service day by 25% or more. And the reason why that's there is not all MARC trips stop at every station, whereas core bus, once it goes down the road, apart from express bus, but our local service stops at all stops. So that's why MARC has a different policy there than core bus. In addition, the establishment or abandonment of a station is an element that's part of our current major service change policy, because if we're getting rid of an entire MARC station, that's pretty major. Whereas a single bus stop was not part of our current policy because we have lots of bus stops and they frequently have to change due to construction or whatever may occur, safety conditions. So that wasn't part of that, but MARC service, a single rail station being added or removed is pretty major. All four of those remain in our policy. We are not changing those, but we are adding an additional element, which would be the cumulative alteration of at least 15% or more of the total MARC system, the revenue miles, revenue hours for that MARC system on a given service change. So our MARC system has three lines, the Penn line, the Camden line, and the Brunswick line. And if collectively those three lines are changing by 15% or more in a given service change, we will evaluate such to ensure that the changes are done in an equitable manner. You could have had a scenario, say, where the Brunswick line and the Camden line were changing by 10%, and the Penn line was changing by 20%. And due to the demographics of those, there could have been inequity, but neither of which was, none of them were changing by 25%, and that may not have been evaluated in the formal Title VI service equity process. Now it would be. For commuter bus, the policy is fairly similar to MARC. Alteration of a route's revenue miles or revenue hours on a given service day by 25% or more, that stays the same. Change to the span of service on a route by 90 minutes or more on a given service day, that also stays the same. Elimination of service to a stop unless there is another stop within 3 miles of its location, that is staying the same. Establishment of a new stop is also staying the same. And the reason for that 3 miles and why that differs from core bus and MARC is that sometimes contracts change with park and ride, and the service needs to switch a location. But given that the majority of riders for commuter bus are driving to the stop where they go and then riding the service, if there's a new stop or replacement stop within 3 miles, then that's something that is not considered to be major because they're able to get to that destination in a reasonable amount of time. That's not as big of a change for the riders on that mode as it would be in other modes. But we are proposing a new element to this policy. So we're keeping everything we have, but we're proposing that the additional element would be cumulative alteration of at least 15% of the total commuter bus system's revenue miles or revenue hours in a given service change. And that mirrors what we've seen in the other 2 modes so far, such that if the whole commuter bus system is changing by 15% due to some dramatic world circumstances, and we sure do hope that there's a bonanza of funding that we can add service. But if such a thing occurs, we want to make sure we're doing it in an equitable manner, that the minority populations and the non-minority populations are equitably receiving the new service relative to the service area demographics, and that if there are an unfortunate scenario where service is reduced, that burden that is not disproportionately borne by minority populations or low-income populations. For Metro Subway Link, we have no proposed changes at this time. Our current policy of 25% or more of revenue hours or revenue miles on a given service day, including establishment or abandonment of the line, remains the same. Change the span of service by 90 minutes on a given service day stays the same. Change the number of stops at a given station by 25% or more, and then establishment or abandonment of a station. All of those elements are remaining the same. The reason why we haven't proposed additional elements there is because we only have 1 line on the Metro Subway Link mode. So you wouldn't necessarily have a scenario where there's multiple routes, multiple lines, and they're changing by less than 25%, but there's a big change, and we want to make sure that it's equal among the lines and equitable. There's only 1 line, so we don't have that policy being proposed. So that remains the same. And the same is true for light rail link. So the light rail link policy is identical to our Metro policy, and there are no changes proposed in that regard because there currently is only 1 line, 1 route on light rail mode. Now, it is important to note that there are some exemptions to this major service change policy. The federal government allows us to have certain scenarios, emergency scenarios, temporary scenarios, where a change would otherwise have been deemed major. You could have a scenario where you're triggering the policy. There's a change in the span of service by more than 90 minutes. There's a change in the number of revenue hours by more than 25%. But we're not required to conduct a formal Title VI service equity analysis because it's exempt. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with these, but it is important that we share these with you. So under our current policy, the exemptions that we have spelled out that we will adhere to, which fit within the federal guidelines, are seasonal service changes. So some of our bus routes increase in service during the school year and decrease during the summer. And for this, for the lots, for the locally operated transit systems, some places they may have the opposite, where they increase service during the summer. Perhaps out in Ocean City, they may increase service during the summer and then reduce it during the off season. And because these things are cyclical in nature and they're expected to happen, and they happen every year, and we know the service is coming back, that's why they would be exempt from the major service change policy, because it's not a permanent change, even though it is major. The creation or modification or discontinuation of a pilot, a demonstration route within the first 12 months, that is exempt from the equity analysis process because If we had to conduct it, it may prevent us from trying out new pilot routes because of the costs associated with the equity analysis. And the federal government wants to allow agencies to try out pilots, and then if it works, conduct the equity analysis and keep that route. Any diversions or frequency changes due to local events, construction, weather, emergencies, those are exempt. So there may be the Baltimore Marathon or a festival where we have to divert the route. Those are exempt, even though there may be a significant change, but they're temporary. And then finally, a lengthy paragraph there on emergency service changes, including changes in routes or service frequencies, which may be necessitated due to a disaster, which severely impairs public health or safety, changes in access to public streets, or the ability of MDOT MTA equipment to travel on public streets. Emergency service changes are things that we can implement immediately without a public hearing, provided that a finding identifying the circumstances under which the change was took is made by the administrator. And if it lasts longer than 12 months, then we have the equity analysis before it exceeds 12 months. So those all are staying within exemptions. And it's important to note that these are all things that must be less than 12 months in duration. Temporary emergencies, there could be a sinkhole or whatever it may be, where we have a major change. But as long as we restore service within 12 months, we do not need to have the equity impact. The only new addition here, where we wanted to add some clarity to a type of scenario that could occur, primarily affects our rail modes, and that is outages due to planned or unplanned maintenance, inspections, or repairs. Sometimes the rail modes have track work that needs to occur, or there may be a replacement of a station. And during that time, the stops at that station would change by more than 25%. Or we may have to short line or whatever it may be due to those construction. As long as that construction is less than 12 months, it's a temporary change. It's something that is not a plan to be a permanent change, and it's not having a permanent impact on our riders. And those would be exempt from the formal Title VI service equity process. Again, it is important to note that equity is considered at all periods during our service development process, from the initial ideas and then planning and outreach to the community. We incorporate equity throughout the process, but today we're specifically talking about the federal government's Title VI Civil Rights Act formal service equity analysis process, which is governed by this major service change policy. And for those of you who have sharp eyes or listen very closely, you may have heard me say at the very beginning of the slide, under Title VI, our requirements are to conduct fair service and fair equity analyses. And you may be thinking, we just spelled out a very detailed policy for major service changes. What about major fare changes? Why don't we have a major fare change policy that dictates when we conduct fair equity analyses? And the reason for that is that the FTA treats fare changes differently than service changes. Agencies are allowed to set their own service change policies that determine when they conduct service equity analyses, but that's not the case with fare changes. Under federal government requirements, all fare changes, whether it's an increase or decrease in fare or fare medium or a structure change, are required to have a fare equity analysis. So it's not if you change your fare by 25% or 10% or 15%. If you change your fare, you have to conduct a fare equity analysis. So that's why we haven't established a fair equity change policy, and that's not something that exists. All of our fare changes do get evaluated. And you can find copies of our most recent equity analyses on our website. We are sharing them each time once they're approved. We share them in a timely manner on our website as promptly as possible. So with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I will turn things over to LaToya in case we have any questions that folks may have.
So this time we'll take any questions or comments that people may have based on the information that Joe just shared. If you would like to ask a question, you can indicate by raising your hand using the raise hand feature under the reaction setting, or pressing *9 if you're on a telephone. You can also put your question in the chat box if you don't want to ask it live, and I will read it aloud for the group. We will keep the line open until 7 p.m. when the meeting is set to end. So if you have a question, you can ask it at any time.
Latoya, you might have to change their settings to allow them to unmute themselves.
Okay.
My app has frozen, so I cannot do it. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm not seeing any hands or any questions come through the chat, but we'll still be here. I see our person here on the with the Galaxy has come off mute. So if you have questions or comments, we can hear you. If you can also state your name since there's not a name attached to your phone.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. This is my new phone. This is Darlene Kane from the Bentlow community and Mothers on the Move. And I appreciate you guys coming on tonight. So mostly being a listening ear for right now. And then I'll comment probably before I get off. And thank you again.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for joining us.
If anybody was late joining us this evening and joined midway through the presentation, we will also be posting the recording of tonight's presentation onto our website, as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint that we shared.
Joe, we can see your screen.
if anyone has any other questions relating to Title VI or ADA requirements or our Title VI program, you can feel free to ask such at this time as well, whether related to our major service change policy or other elements of our Title VI program. If you would like us to go back to any of the slides that we covered, we could do so. If that's something you would like, we can go back to previous slides covered. We have 2 minutes left in the period that we had scheduled for this evening. So if you would like to make a comment on this presentation, we have 2 minutes left.
So it looks like we've reached the 7 o'clock hour. If there's no additional comments or questions on the presentation today, we will be ending the call here shortly. We'd like to thank everyone that joined us and everyone that stayed through the end. As Joe stated, the presentation and the slides will be posted to our website. And we have 2 additional meetings this week, tomorrow and Wednesday. And I apologize, Joe, do you have the times in front of you?
Tomorrow, Tuesday's meeting starts at 3 p.m. and Wednesday's meeting starts at 10 a.m.
So thank you. So if you have any additional questions or comments, you can join us for either of those.